Hi, I'm Simon Livo. I'm an evolutionary ecologist at the University of New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Jerry Husak. I'm an evolutionary physiologist at the University of St. Thomas.
Welcome to Biology Exit Interviews, where we sit down with biologists who've had long and distinguished careers to talk about their science and about how biology has changed over the course of their working lives.
And whether you're brand new to integrative biology or you've been doing it for decades, I hope you'll join us and find something interesting in our stories.
All right. So today, um, Jerry and I are going to be talking to Michael Ryan. Michael Ryan is the Clark Hubbs Regents Professor of Zoology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's had a long and distinguished career working on sexual selection, frogs and fish and various other animals. He has hundreds of publications, too many awards to list, um, lots of NSF grants, and we're very pleased to have Mike with us today to talk about his career in science. So welcome, Mike. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, good talking to you guys.
So, Mike, just to give you some background, this whole idea came about when Jerry and I were at a meeting in Barcelona. It's more than 13 years ago at this point. And we were having a conversation with David Wake, who I believe was one of your mentors. And was telling us about his career and his academic career in particular, and how he got his first job, which was he was offered a job at UC Berkeley when he was still a PhD student. And then by the time he arrived at UC Berkeley, he already had an NSF grant. And that whole experience was is just so alien to anyone who's been on the job market, the academic job market in the last 20 odd years. So maybe we can start there, talking about like your path into academia. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be at UC Austin today.
But can I first, since you said this could be rambling, can I first tell you a fun story about Dave Wake?
Oh yeah, please.
Definitely,
Just
definitely.
just adore. You know, you passed away a while ago.
Yeah.
But when I was a grad student at Cornell, and I did most of my work on Barrow, Colorado Island. So while I was on BCI, the director would invite these luminaries at the time. And I just got to know very well, in some cases, good friends, the whole variety of people. Bob Trivers, who I've stayed with friends all this time, got to meet Ernst Mayr, Richard Dawkins, and John Maynard Smith. So Maynard Smith was writing this book about game theory on the island, and I was in charge of the beer machine. And Maynard Smith loved to drink beer. So we got to be good friends because he would just buy beer by the armloads. And he would have to find me to open the machine and give him change. So anyway, we got to be good buddies. Then while I was under Dave's sponsorship at Berkeley, I'd been working in Kenya for a while. And then instead of coming from Kenya back to the States, I had a friend in Cambridge in the UK. And I thought I would stop to visit him. So I stopped to visit him, and he says, "Oh, there's going to be this great symposium. We'll go to that while you're here." So there's this open area, kind of like a reception thing. So we go in this area, and John Maynard Smith comes over. He grabs me by my hand. Says, Mike, I want to introduce you to somebody. So he pulls me across the room, and he says, "Mike, this is Dave Wake. Dave, have you ever met Mike?" And I hadn't seen Dave for 4 months. And Dave just kind of smirked and said, "Yeah, he's my postdoc." But yeah, Wake was a wonderful guy. But in terms of, getting my job at Austin, I was really fortunate because while I was at Texas, I interviewed at I'm sorry, while I was at Cornell in my last year, I interviewed here at Texas and then also at UCLA. And I got an offer at both places. And then I also got an offer at this to for this Miller Fellowship. And Dave was my sponsor. So I accepted the job at Texas. They were willing to wait for the 2 years while I was at Berkeley. So then I went and worked with Dave, and for those 2 years, knowing that I had this secure job at Texas, which then allowed me to go to Africa during it would have been my last spring semester at Berkeley because I didn't have to worry about the job market. But I actually was offered a job before that when I was so I was at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute doing my grad student work there. And the director, an acting director at that point, Mike Robinson, he just called me in and from the island, and he said, "I want to talk to you." And I thought it was because I was always behind on paying my rent at BCI because the Smithsonian in Washington could never get me my check in time. So I got into his office ready to be chewed out, and he said, "Oh, do you want a job here?" I said, "Yeah, sure, I'd love it." And he said, "So this is the way we'll work it. You have to go back to Cornell for a year, and we'll hire you at this level. You won't have your PhD, so we'll support you for your last year at Cornell, and then after you get your PhD, then you come back here." And I would be the island scientist on Barrow, Colorado Island. So I said, "Yeah, love it. That's great." And then towards right before I left, he took me out to dinner. And as he's dropping me off, he had to take a train out to where this island was. He says, "By the way, you don't have this job anymore." So Ronald Reagan was elected. And then when he became president, he instituted a retroactive federal hiring freeze. So then I lost that job after I accepted it before I had actually started it. So I mean that was fine. That worked out just fine. But yeah, I was just very, very fortunate and those were different times than now.
Yeah, things have changed a little bit, I think, and with regards to job availability and kind of how funds get distributed and make different kinds of positions open like that. Yeah, and thanks for those stories. Those are great. We'd actually probably love to hear more later on about some of these legends that you've worked with in your time. So you have a really great autobiographical chapter in a book, Leaders in Animal Behavior, the Second Generation. And it's fascinating. I think anybody who is interested in behavior and integrative biology should read that because your story is incredible, for sure. But what really always stood out to me after reading that was just like your curiosity, right? And how you love to learn things and to answer questions, which I think is a good quality for a scientist. Um, but we can maybe get back to that later on, or maybe that's part of the answer to my question now is you've been hugely successful in your career, as Simon mentioned, with all your publications, lots of awards. Um, what do you think contributed to that? What's made you such a successful scientist, do you think?
I think a lot of it is serendipity. So I was on Barrow, Colorado Island, and as I said, they would invite these fantastic people to come visit. But the most important thing that happened to me in my career is that my sponsor when I started at Stry was this guy, Stan Rand. And after I got my degree, so Stan and I didn't technically work together. We did have a paper together while I was a grad student. And then when I came to Texas, I didn't work with tundra frogs for another year or so, and I was in DC and ran across Stan in the Natural History Museum. Stan said, "We should start working together now." So we did. And I worked with Stan until he passed away. And he was such a major, major influence in a lot of the work that we did. So, for instance, we did a transect from Texas to Panama driving through all of Central America, collecting frog calls and tissues. And we worked a lot in Peru and in Ecuador and in Venezuela and Brazil. And we just spent so much time together in the field. And Stan was brilliant. And I gave a talk in his honor a couple of years ago at a celebration at Stry. And I said, we define a lot of institutions by their what they have to offer people physically. I said, but what's more important than the physical parts of a institute are the human parts of the institute, and that there's nobody more humane than Stan. And I think about this all the time because we worked together. I think he passed maybe in 2011-ish, maybe 2013. Um, so that was one thing. I mean, that was the most important part of my career. But then being on Barrow, Colorado Island, I mean, I was interested in lots of questions, but there was a lot of people around who would be so stimulating. So, a big part of my graduate student work, which we've continued, I've continued kind of vicariously up to this point, is this discovery that this frog-eating bat would listen to frog calls and was able to capture males that were advertising for females. The more attractive the males call, the more likely it was that that the bats would feed on them. So I'm thinking, and Merlin Tuttle is here now in Austin, and he's been here since I've been here. He has an NGO on bat conservation. And I'm thinking if I had never run into Merlin, things would have been quite a lot different. There's this whole chunk of my research that never would have been done. And then when I moved to Texas, they hired a neurobiologist who was a postdoc at Cornell when I was a graduate student at Cornell. And then we started doing these studies together where I would do the behavior and Walt Wilczynski would do the neurobiology. So that's a long answer to your question, but the short answer is, yeah, I'm innately curious about the systems I'm working on, but I've just happened to be surrounded by all these amazing and wonderful people that have blessed much of my career over the years. So the serendipity. Someone told me at Stry once after we started working on BCI, he said, Mike, you're not a good scientist, you're a lucky scientist.
That's awesome. Well, that's really interesting, though. 'Cause my impression is that kind of the younger generation of kind of up and coming scientists has their own impression that many years ago, scientists largely worked more or less on their own, maybe with a collaborator or two. And that collaboration has really exploded in more recent years, that there's a lot more collaborative science done. I guess do you think that's true, or do you think it's always been really collaborative like it is today?
Well, I think it's collaborative in a very different way today. I think, using myself as an example, you would just sort of be bouncing, ping-ponging against the walls and what you're doing, and then you would run across folks who would be interested in what you're doing, but from a very different angle. But now I think what happens with a lot of folks is it is very collaborative, but it's more that it has to be collaborative because a lot of grad students now you're just put inside of this system. And it's an integrative, collaborative system, but it's not collaborations that the grad students themselves have sought out. It's more like being a cog in a bigger machine.
That's interesting that you say that, because so well, at least I only met you last year at the Integrative Comparative Biology meeting,
Yeah.
and when Jerry and I both started off, both of our dissertations were on kind of similar themes. We were both trying to combine sexual selection with sort of physiological ideas. And my impression of it at the time, trying to get those papers out as a young, complete unknown, was that what I had done is I'd produced a piece of work that two different groups of people hated for entirely different reasons.
Yeah,
And and what did you have the same experience when you were actually trying to do integrative things for the first time? Did you find that there was resistance to it?
absolutely, absolutely. Um, I would, so I had, when I was at Cornell, I had this great neurobiologist on my committee, Bob Kopranica, and he was one of the early founders of neuroethology, relating, basically saying, what does the frog's brain, what does the frog's ear tell the frog's brain? And so I would do, because of Copernicus' influence, some of my earlier studies were behavioral tests of neurobiological predictions. And then I remember someone coming back from a neuro meeting saying, "Oh yeah, people are very critical of you. They say, if you wanted to be a neurobiologist, why don't you do neurobiology?" And I said, "Well, because I'm not a neurobiologist." But one way to test some of these theories are behavioral. And then another kind of friction was with grants with National Science Foundation. So a
Mm.
lot of times and this is when I was doing these grants with a real neurobiologist, with Walt Wilczynski, that they would be co-reviewed. So it was really double jeopardy, because if the behavior panel thought it was fine, but the neuro panel didn't, then it was sunk. If the neuro panel liked it, but the behavior didn't like it, then it was sunk. So yeah, so we ran into those problems. I wouldn't say a bunch, but it was not unusual for that to happen to us.
Do you feel like the situation is different these days compared to when you're starting off trying to do integrative things? Do you feel like integrative research is more welcome now?
I think so. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think it is, because um, integrative biology in general, does have a better reputation now. And as we speak, they're reorganizing National Science Foundation. And one thing that's going to happen, from my understanding, is they're going to do away with a lot of these divisions within biology. So for instance, in this iOS part of NSF, there's a neuromodulation panel, there's an animal behavior panel. I think that's all going to be considered together now. So my understanding is that'll probably promote more integration rather than less integration. But the thing is, when you integrate across these areas, it's really important. Sometimes people on the behavior end will not take the neuro seriously.
Mm.
Oh, we're going to inject this frog with this hormone and see what it does, without really understanding the endocrinology of the hormone. Oh, we'll just take dopamine and put it in the brain and see what it does, and then we'll publish it. Whereas neurobiologists sometimes can not really understand evolution and selection. It's kind of um, uh, this rote schedule that, okay, so we show this, so the animals do this, and then this is why they do this. So we've just demonstrated that this evolved for this particular adaptive function, without actually really thinking about it very carefully. So I think what's really important in these integrative studies is that people, and this is why collaborations are the best way to do this, that people are taking very seriously both of the aspects of the integration that they're trying to do. I don't know if that's clear, but that's what's happened to us a bunch of times.
Yeah, that's very true. And you do see that quite a bit. Still, it seems like where, someone who's trained in area X, gets an interesting question in area Y and kind of starts dabbling when they don't really, have the full set of tools to do that in the entirely appropriate way.
Yeah,
Um,
I was running a symposium once, and someone in this symposium who's a very well-known molecular developmental biologist, someone who is more of a morphologist, gave a talk where they were talking about some hormonal underpinnings, and this woman sitting next to me said, after that talk was done, she said, Mike, one thing it's really important when people are talking about another field, at minimum, you need to understand the lingo and the jargon that people are using. And you don't want to throw around terms that you don't really understand what they mean.
I think that's absolutely true. I've been to a couple of workshops that have been aimed at sort of like combining disparate things. And every single time, like at least the first day or two is like, all right, what are we actually talking about? Like, how do these different groups of people understand words that we think have common meanings?
Yeah. And one common example, and this still happens all the time, especially in sexual selection. Females will want to choose the males of the highest fitness. Well, the male's fitness is determined by getting to mate. So the females aren't assessing fitness. They're actually determining the male's fitness, unless, and that's true if you mean Darwinian fitness. Now, if you mean physical vigor, that's very different, right? The females do want to mate with males that are physically better off because they might get more resources, they might be better parents. But this term fitness is just used on both ends, but on the proximate and ultimate ends, without a careful definition of, what are you talking about when you say fitness?
Right. And then there were long periods of time when people were talking about fitness, but really what they were measuring was survival.
Yeah, exactly. And only survival.
yeah, that's a good example of very vague definitions, and there are many others I'm sure we could all come up
Yeah.
with here for sure. I mean, I think also just understanding what you're working with too, and I think that's why I've admired your work for so long is that you really had an amazing understanding of what the organism was doing in its natural settings. And I know lots of other, including Harry Green, with whom you interact a lot, I'm sure, has been a big advocate for natural history for as long as I can remember, and even to today. Do you feel like that's still kind of slipping away, or do you think
Yeah.
there's a little resurgence?
No, no, I don't. Harry actually is here now.
Right, right.
It's down the hall and around the corner. And we do talk about this a lot. Um, no, but as an example, our program here, Ecology, Evolution, Behavior, when I first came here, a lot of the students would have had a lot of field experience. And one of our faculty here, this wonderful butterfly ecologist, Larry Gilbert, used to teach a field course every summer, and the students would come back from that course just so excited about natural history. And when I was at Cornell, this neurobiologist, Bob Kopranica, he was an engineer from MIT, and he worked at Bell Labs. So, real engineering type. I was not in his lab. Anyone in his lab that wanted to take the OTS course, he would pay for it and he would encourage you. So one of Copernicus' students who did quite well, Peter Narens, was also an engineer, and Copernica convinced Peter to take this OTS course and paid the whole bill for it. So, this is an example where even somebody far away from natural history, like Copernica was, and that's not a criticism. I mean, he was an electrical engineer, understood the importance of natural history. And the, we still see a lot of that, but I don't think we see enough of that.
You mentioned Stan Rand a little while ago, and I never got to meet Stan, but I read a lot of his papers when I was a graduate student, and especially there were some papers that he wrote like back in the 60s that I thought they were just wonderful. Like people don't write papers like that anymore. He'd be talking about how he was sitting on his porch, drinking a gin and tonic and watching like two Annelius Lineotopus fight.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and
And
I love those papers. They're a real treasure trove of natural history, which, as you say, is just.
yeah. Yeah. And some of them he would talk about when he was in his hammock, he would see the lizards doing something. Nope, nope. Stan was great. He was great. And he always had a really strong emphasis. So he and I, it wasn't a friction, but Stan would always push the natural history aspects. And then I would always push the importance of doing experiments to testing these ideas that we would see in nature. But the two of us, together we spent so much time in the field, observing things, observing wonderful natural history events. And yeah, we were working in the Amazon once, and it was bright blue sky, bright sun, and we stopped. And I said, Stan, is it raining? And he said, yeah, it sounds like it's raining. So what the hell is this? But we don't see any rain coming down. So we looked at our feet and there's these ants. And it looked like the sound was coming from the ants. So then we get down on our hands and knees and the ants are banging their heads into the leaf litter, making these sounds that sound like rain.
Wow.
That's
And
great.
Stan says, that's an alarm call, I think. So we wait till they calm down and then he'll go back in the nest. So Stan takes out a twig and he upsets the nest and they all come back and they're banging their heads into the leaf litter and it sounds like rain again. We both got so excited. And since we had tape recording equipment, we recorded this. Oh, that's great. We're going to write a little note about this, head banging behavior. And luckily, before I wrote it up, I looked at Wilson's and Hodobler's books on ants. And of course, they had seen this before. And it wasn't, but this was just so typical of, being in the field with Stan.
That sounds like it was a blast. I'd love to see that.
It was a blast.
But it's true. I love those Rand's papers, of course, and but it seems and it's almost a shame that with as publications try to squeeze more and more papers into journals so that each paper is shorter and shorter, you miss a lot of those things.
Oh, yeah.
One of my favorites is Henry Fitch's works. I was lucky enough to get to know him pretty well before he
Oh,
passed.
wow.
Great guy. But I still go back to his old papers from the 50s and 60s and find all sorts of tidbits that he either predicted or already saw, like you're
Yep.
describing. They're just there to be found by somebody.
Yep.
Um, it'd be nice if we could get back to, putting a little bit more into our papers, but I don't know. That doesn't seem very likely in the current publishing climate.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And especially depending where you want to publish. If you're not as concerned as getting everything, and again, this is something that Harry Green and I talk about, the importance of publishing more natural history notes. And even if it's not going to be in a journal of with a huge impact score, it's still really important. We were working in the Darien once and in the Darien Gap, not just the province. And we walked by this little group of tundra frogs calling. And we're listening. And I said, it was my daughter and one of my grad students. And I said, wait a minute, there's a tundra frog. It's making a chuck, but it's not making a whine. So we just watched for a while, and there's no question at all that this was happening. And this is not something that you normally see, you normally observe. we didn't have our tape recorders with us, and we didn't have a permit to collect mails. But we wrote that up for her review, and it's something that I've cited a couple of times, just making the argument that there's standing genetic variation in behavior that we might not appreciate, even though this is a sample size of one. It's just showing that we can't assume that we understand all, that we've quantified all the phenotypic variation that's around.
Yeah, that's a good point. It existed, so
Yeah.
That, that's interesting. Well, for a couple of reasons, and one thing that Jerry and I talk about a fair amount is that how science is, or at least biology, is sort of trendy. There are things that become popular and things become less popular. And one paper that I always think about, since we both have worked on life history for the last 10 years, is there was a paper that came out showing how some things have become more popular over the last 30, 40 years and some less so. And what is dead last and what's become most unpopular is life history, uh,
Oh,
which I think is crazy because it's so fundamental.
yeah.
lucky
And
us.
there's such an emphasis on conservation. And one of the most important ecological measures relevant to conservation, of course, is life history.
Have you noticed over the course of your career sort of this bandwagoning, these trends coming and going? Um,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I remember being at a conference and John Krebs talking about, and he wasn't being snide. And he said something like, I remember when animal communication was a real fad, but clearly now the most important thing in behavioral ecology is optimal foraging theory. And then a number of years later, I saw him giving a talk, and he said, a while ago I said animal communication really seems to be receding. Well, was I wrong? And this and Harry Green is giving a talk here about science writing, and he was asking me about my Tunga Frog book. So I went back and I looked at the citations. So that was published in 1985. And the 2 years where it had the most citations are, I think it was 2003 and 2006. So it went up then and then kind of came down. And I mean, that's because a lot of, obviously, because more people are working with these frogs than when I started. But the point is, yeah, you see these trends coming and going all the time.
I remember in the sometime in the late 90s reading a lot of papers about animal intelligence. Um, and that was something that it sort of came back in a different way, but
Yeah.
that was the first time I ever noticed it.
Yeah. And now a trend, which I think is either stabilized or maybe it's a little bit in its descendancy, is animal personality.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, and what, 10 years ago, whenever that became popular, um, it really took off. And then it stabilized for a while, and I think I'm not a real fan of that label. I like these studies looking at behavioral variation amongst individuals. I don't think we need to relate it to a human concept. I think that makes things a little confused. But regardless, that's another one has become very popular and kind of stabilized now, I think, in popularity.
Yeah, that one really exploded and then sort of infiltrated a lot
Yeah,
of adjacent disciplines as well. It was pretty fascinating to watch in real time as it kind of went everywhere.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember Tim Cluttenbrock was giving a invited talk at an animal behavior meeting, and he grabbed me in the hallway and he said, what's wrong with you people on this side of the pond? What is this personality stuff? But now it's as popular in the UK and Europe as as I think it kind of started in the States. Uh, but then it became as popular there as it is here.
You mentioned something in the autobiographical chapter you sent over. So you talked about growing up in the Bronx. And so were you one of those kids who was like out there collecting animals, or was I get
No,
did
I yeah, I was, and in a very bizarre way. So, you know, I'm from a big family. I'm the oldest of 11 kids, and my brothers and I would love these wildlife. It was Mutual of Omaha, so nothing like the Planet Earth or the wonderful BBC productions that are available now. But we would love watching that. And we were in the Bronx, we're in a city. So we would go on these quote unquote safaris, these collecting expeditions where we'd go to empty lots where they had demolished buildings and we'd collect grasshoppers and we would see how many that we could catch. But on the other hand, an advantage of being in New York was I remember my father often took us to the Bronx Zoo, and then my mother often took us to the American Museum of Natural History. So that really whetted or certainly it whetted my appetite for that. And then north of the Bronx, going into part in the Bronx and part in the next county, which isn't part of New York City and Yonkers, there was this big Van Cortlandt Park, which was a lot of woods. So we would go there a lot. We could walk there from where we lived in the Bronx, and we go hiking. And then we moved to this area in New Jersey when I was 10. And I think, as I say in that chapter, it's like ecological release. We were surrounded by forest. There were cows wandering up and down the street. We could go hunting, just walk across the street with our shotguns and go hunting once we were 14. And I remember my mother telling me years later, she said, you kids would just disappear on the weekends. You take your sleeping bags and go off into those woods. And the mothers would say, yeah, it seems like it's all right. They come back every Sunday. So we were really interested in any exposure that we could get environments. And they just become more and more onerous. And for people like us, the Ayakuk folks, they have rules that have come about because of their rightful concerns about lab animals and mostly about, primates and lab mice and lab rats. And they're so uninformed and unprepared to think about non-model systems. And they're often not sympathetic at all. And in many cases, they don't want to be educated about what the needs are. They just want you to follow these rules that were developed for biomedical systems. So I think that's the one of the biggest differences. Then there's other things, especially for field biologists that are actually good. But when I had started, permits working in other countries was not a big deal. And now it's a very big deal, as it should be. But that's another big administrative burden that we didn't have to, people my age didn't have to deal with when they were starting out. I'm not complaining about that because it is good. But it is another burden. One thing that hasn't changed though is teaching. I mean, teaching is to me, it's kind of similar to what it's been. You get this captive audience of folks, and what you want to do, at least what you should want to do, is get them very interested in the field of what you're teaching. And those of us interested in animal behavior, I think we have a much easier job than folks in some other fields because it is easy. I think it's easier to get students inherently interested and excited, not to become animal behaviors, but to pay attention to your lectures and get jazz from your lectures. And uh, and I just think that that must be easier for someone teaching animal behavior than someone teaching some other courses. So that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed. And in some sense, in terms of teaching undergraduates, it might be a bit easier because now a lot of undergrads have seen all these wonderful natural history productions that are on TV or that are streaming. And this provides a huge resource for us to use in our teaching, which was never available before. So we can supplement our teaching while we're lecturing. We could say, and look at this. And then we can show them these film clips of animals doing very interesting things that, when I was an undergrad, when I was a grad student, the folks teaching these courses didn't have those things available. So I think that's a change, a real change in the positive direction for the kind of stuff that we're interested in.
Yeah, you talked a little bit in the book chapter, and also you mentioned it earlier about the importance of field trips. Um, and so that is certainly how it was for me. I basically changed everything to go the biology route when I took an undergraduate field trip. And I think that's true for a lot of people as well.
Yeah.
Um, do you find that for the classes you teach, students are still interested in field work and going on field trips? Because I've heard from some of our colleagues that there's sort of a reluctance for students to do that these days.
Well, when I was hired here, I would teach vertebrate natural history, and we would go on field trips. And in the end of the course, we would go out to this wonderful area, Big Bend, for about 4 days. And most of these students were Texas residents and had never been there. And this would just open their eyes. I don't know if it changed the career trajectories of any students, but they would just get so excited. And again, with Harry Green here, I remember going on a field trip that Harry taught yearly at Berkeley, and this is when I was at Berkeley, in the Mojave. And it was kind of the same thing. Harry would be introducing the students to the ecology of the deserts and especially focusing on reptiles. And you could just see how the students, it's an exaggeration maybe to say it changed their lives, but I think it certainly changed their outlooks about natural history. So here we have, so I don't teach vertebrate natural history now, but the course is still taught, and we do have some other field courses, local field courses, and the students just love them, and they really love them. Not enough students take those courses probably, but the ones that do take them, not only are they very excited about them, but then word of mouth spreads, and these courses usually fill up very quickly. So I mean, we have a ton of students here, but there is still a contingent of students that really appreciate these field courses.
Yeah, that's really great to hear for sure. Um, so kind of bouncing off of that, I guess. So thinking about these students, undergraduate or graduate or otherwise, what bit of advice would you give them to be successful in our field of integrative biology?
Well, it's tough. It's really tough. So, we're reviewing prospective grad student applicants now, and I have this wonderful undergrad in my lab that we spend a lot of, she's working on a big data set that we have. And, they want to go into academics. And one thing that's a little different now than when I was a grad student is a lot of folks would like to teach at a small liberal arts college, which is fantastic. And I mean, I could do that. That would be great. But sometimes the grad students think that it's would be easier than being a professor at an R1 university. And it's not because I've had students do that. I visited my students who are small liberal arts colleges, and they're very fulfilled. Uh, but their jobs no what is not any easier than my job is. It's very demanding, just in a different way. But you have to be we need to be honest with the students that if they want to be an academic, they have to understand that there's a lot of not just hard work, but a lot of serendipity involved. And they need to have a plan B. And those plan Bs end up not being in many cases, not being a step down, but just an alternative that they hadn't thought about before. So just as an example, I have two former PhD students who are working for this Bat Conservation International, and they just totally love their jobs. And they like their jobs more than they think they would have enjoyed being being in academia. That's what I tell them.
Yeah, that sounds like solid advice for
Yeah.
sure.
You've had this really long, really distinguished career, and you managed to stay productive and keep doing high quality science the entire time. And I know that for some people, that becomes a challenge at some point. Some people, their interests change or whatever the case may be. And so if you strip away everything, all of the recognition, the awards, the papers, what is it that's kept you going this entire time? What is it that to you is absolutely essential, and what is it that is superfluous?
It's the grad students and the postdocs. And now that I'm at the stage in my career where I'm winding down, um, this is especially clear to me. So right now I have one grad student, and I kind of have a postdoc, but he's in Montreal, so I'm not actually paying all of his salary. And then I mean, intellectually I knew this, but now I'm feeling it, how important that having this community of really bright young scientists that get engaged and get excited about what they're doing, can just really, really keep you going, really keep you going. Um, we have a paper coming out in a couple pretty soon. In science, and it's a very simple study. It's asking if humans and animals share acoustic preferences for mating signals. So we give them, this is a gamified crowd sourcing thing. And I hate using the word we, and I'll explain why, but we give them choices of pairs of mating sounds from mammals and birds and frogs and insects, where researchers have shown that females would prefer A to B, and then we ask people what they prefer. And we find that, as Darwin suggested, that in some sense that animals do and humans do share this quote unquote taste for the beautiful. And the my postdoc and somebody else, the senior author, did about 85% of the work on this. And I'm so excited about this study, even though my contribution was on the minimum side. But this would never have happened if I hadn't had this great postdoc. And so I think that's one thing that helps you stay excited and engaged is being surrounded by having a really good community. And it's not necessary that it be grad students or postdocs. It could be in, other kinds of contexts. For me, that's kind of what's kept me going. And I can really feel it now as I'm deciding to, kind of wind down and looking towards retirement.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's been a real treat to talk to you.
Yeah, this was a whole lot of fun, a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, sounds good. And thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this. This was really fun.